Today, I'm talking about 5 strategies to boost fat loss results for clients, which you guys are in the online coaching space, probably doing some in-person work as well. You guys know the importance of being able to come up with a fat loss plan and help clients get leaner and lose weight. Coaching itself is a results-based business. And when you're able to deliver results, you will never go out of business. So that's what we really want to focus on here today. I do pride myself on being an adult educator. If you're completely new, never met me before, my name is Dr. Marc Morris. I'm based out of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I've been an online nutrition coach and educator for the last 15 years, online specifically. Even when I was working with so many clients that I knew in person, I still did all the fulfillment online, which is why tools and softwares and strategies through companies like Everfit are really, really important and allow us to do more meaningful work. So in the last 5 years, I've been teaching mainly nutrition coaches and certifying them. And I'm going to teach you a little bit about how we go about creating fat loss plans and some of the helpful strategies and tips that we give to clients to allow them to get results. I do pride myself on being an adult educator. So what I'm hoping is by the end of this webinar, in the next 30 minutes and then some time for Q&A, here's what you'll be able to do. You'll be able to explain how fat loss happens, how it actually occurs. There's so much misinformation out there, but we should be able to get to the bottom of it. You should also be able to set up a nutrition client on a fat loss plan, talking about what matters, what they're need to focus on, integrating some of the Everfit opportunities and how to do it within their platform, as well as troubleshoot client scenarios, especially ones that aren't getting as good of results. So we'll talk about that as well. If we get stuck in the weeds here, I want you to come back to these learning objectives. So you think of, hey, what was I supposed to take away from this? If I get a little off topic, which I can, but I probably should. But that's what I want you to take away from this. Way back when I first started coaching, this is a before and after picture from 10 years ago. I remember the scenario very, very closely. But something I was able to pick up on relatively early as a business lesson that really served me well. One of my business partners at the gym I was doing some nutrition coaching and said something to me that was really stuck with me over the years. And that was, I was getting some success and referrals and people were reaching out to me and I was picking up more clients. And he astutely pointed out that, the reason why so many people are signing up for your coaching is that you're able to deliver results. Like people are improving, they're getting better, they're talking about it, they're walking billboards for your services. And he said, when you can do that, you'll always be successful. And I know in a world where education and knowledge is extremely important, but application and the ability to work with clients and get them to do the things that they need to do to get results is critical. It's the thing that's going to serve you well. So we need to really focus on that application piece. So with that in mind, I want to show you the step-by-step process I use and some helpful strategies along the way to get fat loss results for my clients. If you can get results, you barely even need to market your service because it'll speak for itself. So let's talk about that and how to do that within coaching. Feel free to take notes, but we're going to send you over the slides later today or, relatively quickly, as well as the recording. If you can save your questions for the end, that'll be helpful. And I also got an opportunity for you at the end as well to put this all together and make it so much easier to apply. So stay tuned for that. But let's dive in. Some really cool, I've been talking about nutrition coaches in general and online coaches and their service. And we're starting to get some higher level resources and observations around what online coaches actually do. A big study done by Feastgood in 2023 surveyed nearly 200 coaches about who are the people that they work with and what do they want to accomplish in those type of things. And a large proportion of them, more than the majority, up to 61% of coaches said that the majority of their clients have body composition and weight loss goals. This is what they come in saying. Even if that result or something leads them to something else, which in many times it does, I almost like weight loss at times, fat loss is a gateway goal at times in terms of where it could take people and really starts that process. So being able to fulfill on this stuff is one of the most important things you need in your business. And this is proof that many coaches are focusing on this stuff with their clients. From a marketing perspective, we do also want to be able to fulfill on the stuff that people actually want. And that's business 101. So let's talk about a little bit more about what to do this. I got 5 tips for you today. So We're going to break those down. The first one being, I remember my client here, Arlene, amazing client, powerlifting grandma. She's in her 60s, had a powerlifting world record in the 84 kilo class. I remember her specifically came to me to drop a weight class. She wanted to come down, get a little bit leaner, focus on nutrition, improve her eating habits, but specifically drop some weight so she could lift in the 72 kilo class. And I remember this situation specifically because the rate at which she lost weight was rapid. And I was almost thinking like, this is way too fast. But there was an important lesson in all this stuff. Arlene lost 12 pounds in her first 5 weeks working with me, and she's able to lose 30 pounds total and keep it off for the 3 years that we worked together. And she's still in this place. We still touch base every once in a while. But for coaches at times, we seem to think that like we always know what's best for our client and kind of push them in that direction. But when people start this process off with them and they start to build momentum and maybe they have more like rapid results at the beginning, it's just human nature to be like, hey, you got to earn it. We need to slow this down. We need to set this up for sustainability, when really those results might be the thing that keeps them going, keeps them engaged, keeps them building the right habits to set up that success down the road. So we don't want to get in the way of that. We want to help clients build momentum with quick wins. And sometimes, even at the beginning, if it's a more water weight than fat loss, or it's more, this or that, we don't really want to get in the way of that, because momentum is one of the most powerful things that we can build within results and get going. So we really want to focus on that. And if we could focus on the big rocks in terms of the big picture variables that our clients need to be able to manage and influence to get a specific result, we'll be in the best place. We're going to talk a lot about energy balance and calories and the calorie deficit today, as well as protein intake and steps. But when we can really focus on those big rocks and get people getting results and seeing the results of that right off the bat, and we have literature to support this, the more successful they will be down the road. I remember, again, I talked about not going off on tangents, but I remember being like a 6-year-old boy wanting to get into karate. And I remember wanting to get into karate because, when they like break those boards and how cool it looks, like you'd go there and you'd like chop a board and it would, it would break and explode and you'd have all this power and all that stuff. And I remember like asking my mom to like, hey, I want to do this. I want to do this stuff. Can you get me signed up for karate? And I remember she's like, yeah, of course we can. And I had this idea and vision in my mind of what it would work and how it would work and what I wanted to do. And I remember going to karate. And I remember like the first 2 to 3 weeks of these lessons. First of all, I was in no position to break a board. That's besides the point. But for the first 2 to 3, classes, 2 weeks of classes, we did nothing other than like sit around in a circle and work on self-discipline and all important things. But I never really got into the action. I never really like did any moves. I never did any of that stuff. And I lost interest really quickly. I never would do karate. I would never, to this day, still haven't broke one of those boards or even done any cool karate moves. And it partially could be because I didn't see any of those quick wins. I wasn't interested in it enough. And we got to think about this stuff when we start to work with clients. It's important to build momentum. Another client scenario here. I remember this client specifically in Central Canada, our summers, since the winters are so brutal, everyone takes complete advantage of them. It's almost like things stop for 6 to 8 weeks in the middle of the summer and everyone's at their cottage or the lake or doing those things. And I remember, our fitness community and stuff kind of started they almost stopped clients from starting the process of working with them just because of this thing, like almost getting in the way of itself. This client came to me and it was middle of July and said, here's what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And I think a lot of times people think, well, let's set you up for success and let me tell you what I think is going to be the best path for you. But you really want to strike when the iron is hot. And it's almost like getting that head nodding effect when someone tells you what they need to do. Of course, we want to give the best expectations and coach them with the best knowledge and be able to, put them in the best position. But a lot of times that's making sure that we're doing that while the iron's hot. This client wanted to start in the middle of the summer. Let them start in the middle of summer. Don't say no. Do what's best for them, but also do it in a way that's going to allow them to get the process going and get results. Now, the other thing is Oh man, I've had this scenario even this week coaching some of our coaches. I think a lot of times people think, hey, I need to give, you know, I remember doing this in education and lectures. Like you feel like you need to give your clients, give your students everything there is to know on a topic. But to me, that's the complete opposite of coaching. You don't want to give them everything, and you also don't want to change everything at once. You want to adjust and change the big picture variables that are going to give people the most results at the beginning in a non-invasive way. If we can get away with getting great results without having to do much, we're always going to have a card up our sleeve and somewhere to go, somewhere to adjust to, as well as they're not going to have that scenario where, it's going to be overwhelming for them. And your job as a coach is to remove barriers, not to add things to them. I would say the number one problem for many online coaches as they get started working with clients is that they're trying to adjust way too much at once. They're not very prescriptive in terms of, they tell their clients, here's all the things you could do, not specifically what you feel like they need to do minimally, and kind of go from there. I almost like to call this process or this thought process the elevator method. If I had a scenario with a client and I only had 60 seconds with them going up an elevator to the floor before we go our separate ways, what would be the most important thing I need to tell them and get them to understand and get them to do? And the education process comes through putting this stuff into action. We want to do all of these things, get people quick wins, get the process moving, fall in line with some of the things that they want to do, especially at the beginning, and don't overload them, to help build momentum, because that's what's going to get you great results. Tip number 2. Now, we talked about fat loss and weight loss in general. We have the first law of thermodynamics. You're not going to get anyone to lose physical tissue in their body without changing some imbalance between the calories that are coming in through our food and drink and the calories that we're burning through movement, basal metabolic rate, spontaneous movement, and those type of things. In order to lose actual physical tissue, there needs to be some imbalance between those things. Now, that doesn't mean you can't technically be at maintenance calories and lose fat, because you can, but there needs to be some imbalance where the energy comes from somewhere, specifically our fat stores, to make up that deficit of energy and create that imbalance. So when we set someone up on a fat loss plan with the intent of putting them on a calorie deficit, to be able to do that, we need to know how much energy they're burning right now to create a plan that puts them in a deficit. So the biggest starting point and the most important point is getting some estimate of how many calories they're burning on average on a day-to-day basis. Now, no one burns the same amount of calories each and every day, and that's okay, because no individual days are exactly the same, but most days are similar. So if we can get a starting point around, where it is similarly for most days, we can tell them and coach them to eat a certain amount of calories that's going to help them start to get results. Now, in order to do this and get a sense of how many calories is my client burning, there's a bunch of different ways to assess this. Some are closer to the truth or most accurate depiction of what they're burning. Some are truly estimates, and that's okay. I think it's important for us to use all the tools at our disposal. Now, we can use different techniques, like a DEXA scan to get a sense of someone's body composition and make some estimates around that in terms of, how many calories they're burning, or doubly labeled water in terms of, getting a true sense of someone's energy expenditure. Most of us don't have access to that, especially in the online capacity. Now, these things are getting less expensive and more accessible. If you have access to them, amazing, great, you can do them. But I think it's just as important to do things that are quick and easy and helpful, as opposed to quote unquote right. And that's one of the biggest things about coaching, is that we want to help individuals. Does it really matter if someone's 6% body fat? I'm less worried about the truth of them being 6% body fat, as opposed to them getting leaner, feeling good, looking a certain way, achieving the goal that's important to them, and it's all relative anyway. So we want to keep that stuff in mind in terms of, it's more important to be helpful than it is to be right. especially when it comes to, measuring energy expenditure or getting a sense of what it is. Like, your work with a client isn't going to make it into a peer-reviewed journal, and that's okay. It doesn't need to be correct. It needs to be helpful. There's other ways you can do that are more accessible. One of them being a calculation. You can pump some of their metrics into a calculation like the Mifflin-St. Jeor or the Harris-Benedict equation. Usually the more variables that are included and the closer you can get to someone's body composition, the better off, the more accurate it will be, right? If we know someone's lean body mass, even if it's an estimate, we'll get a better sense of what is their true energy expenditure. But these are just theoretical numbers around, where we think they should be. My personal bias, and this falls in line with a lot of what you guys do through online coaching and through Everfit and through this type of stuff, is to not just put the calculations in and say like, hey, here's how many calories you should be consuming based on how much energy I think you're burning, but what are they actually doing right now? If you're going to get someone to track their calories and macronutrients and shoot towards some targets, this is an important part of the process because that's going to be what the action step is. So what I would prefer to do, and we'll talk about this in a second, is to get them actually tracking their intake before they start. They can keep a food log, they can keep a journal if they want, but ideally they do it, through a piece of technology, many of which connect to Everfit, but through a piece of technology and a food tracking app where it's easy for us to access the objective numbers through this type of stuff. I remember, oh man, one of my first bodybuilding preps in 2012, my wife, then girlfriend at the time, bless her heart, that she lived through this. But I remember before the tracking apps became really popular, I used to manually log all of my food through a spreadsheet, and I would move like the things around and have all the macronutrients on the side and track these things. And not only would I have like my phone at the table, but I would have a 17-inch laptop at the table, right? I'd be like logging during dinner and stuff. It was terrible. This stuff is so much easier now. It's so much easier to do, especially when you get used to it and build the habits to be able to know generally what you're eating and that type of stuff. The best thing you can do before you start working with someone, get them to track their intake for 3 to 5 days, ideally with a weekend day, to assess what they're actually consuming right now. That's going to give you a better estimate of energy expenditure by proxy and through what they're actually consuming right now, because we can also assess their body weight through that period, see if there are any changes, and get a better sense of not number one, what their nutritional habits are like right now, but actually what they're consuming, and kind of go from there. What happens here and why I prefer this type of stuff is that you can let me know if this sounds familiar. Coach Logan, an amazing coach. He works with mainly rodeo athletes, and Western sports are blowing up in the fitness scene, which is really, really exciting because it makes me feel like hockey was almost 20 years ago in terms of people are now, they see there's money in it. They're seeing that training is super important. They're seeing that taking care of themselves is super important. They just can't just drink Coors Light at the rodeo all day and expect to perform well. Things are getting more serious. Coaches like Coach Logan are coaching athletes in this space. They're starting to take their nutrition more important. Coach Logan went through a basic nutrition cert and started to get a sense of, okay, I want to set, some of my clients up on nutrition plans. How do I do that? He was using textbook calculations like, the Mifflin-St. Jeor to set calories for his fat loss clients. And what would happen is he would use those textbook calculations and get a number to set them at, food levels. They would start doing it and shooting towards those amount of calories, and they would end up gaining weight. They'd end up going in the opposite direction of why they came to work with Coach Logan. That's super frustrating. It's frustrating for everyone. It's frustrating for the client. It's frustrating for the coach. They have to start doing some troubleshooting. At that point, all that he could tell them, I don't know if this scenario sounds familiar when you're like, hey, I'm doing something with a client that should be working, but it's not really working. And why is that the case? And that's because this doesn't mean that, tracking your nutrition isn't important. What it really highlights and illustrates is that there's a big difference between what someone should be doing in a theoretical sense and should be able to do and what should be able to get them a result and what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing, there's some degrees of error baked into it. Underreporting, right? If I'm going to get my clients to track their nutrition, but I completely disregard the fact that, as they get familiar with this stuff, they're going to be underreporting some of it just due to knowledge, but also due to the human nature of reporting stuff back, right? There's the elements of that. So if I don't set some food targets based on that, then there's going to be a big discrepancy, and that discrepancy usually comes in that they gain weight and go in the opposite direction. So setting the starting point is super, super important. What I would prefer you guys to do to find the right starting place for them to track is, again, get them not only doing the calculation, which kind of sets one goalpost on one side and starts to set a range of where they should be, as well as getting them to do some actual tracking. Get them to track for 3 to 5 days, ideally with a weekend day. Tell them not to change, their food habits, not to change what they're typically eating, although they will. That's just human nature, even if we tell them to do that. If I, due to the internet, I have some productivity issues, start scrolling, doing whatever. If I wanted to improve, how productive I am, especially with my computer time, I could start to track my tasks, right? And start to see where I'm spending my time. As soon as I start doing that, what do you think happens? I start to report my best effort, what I think it should be, what I think I should be doing. So I bake in the best representation, I bake in that underreporting and all that stuff. And if I do, so what I'm reporting, be it to just myself or coach, is probably just a reflection of the truth. But it helps us set up a starting range around, hey, what makes sense for us to start a level of food around someone? Now, the biggest thing being, especially as you guys know as coaches, this calorie and macronutrient thing are the biggest influencers of someone's body composition. So I want to start some food levels based on that. But if I don't do it based on what they're actually doing, I'll start them on a number that typically, in many cases, could just be way too high. And they'll tell you that this is way too much food, but I'll do it because I trust you, that type of thing. And their weight comes up. And that's not a good starting place. So starting at a level that is based on what they're actually doing and taking into account where they should be and setting some number based on that will allow you to find the best starting place. And keep in mind, and we have good data on this as well, no one that is severely overweight is in many cases is consuming 1,300 calories a day. There's some underreporting. There is the day that would be captured that would throw them off or lead to a higher energy intake day, maybe a social scenario where they're eating different food, they overconsume hyperpalatable foods. They aren't as captured in that, right? So we want to take all this stuff into consideration. Now, starting the process of getting someone to tracking too can be really educational, right? As we start to do this stuff, they're already kind of getting involved with the plan before it starts. Now, someone like Shara here, who had an amazing transformation to this day, continues to, just be a huge inspiration, keeping these results, taking her own lifting progress super far. But it allows you to meet the individual where they're at in terms of their habits and knowledge as well. It gets things moving in the right direction. Someone like Shara, when I first met her, had a propensity to be on a lower carbohydrate diet, even if she was, participating in a sport that would benefit from eating more carbs. But when I can start to see, hey, let's get you tracking, look at what you're doing, and set some initial food levels based on what they're currently doing compared to where optimally we think they should do. If we just start at the optimal right off the bat, it's going to be a lot for them to adjust to and catch up to. So we want to set some food levels based on what they're currently doing, not just what the theoretical textbook-based scenario says they should be doing. And this all allows us to set the right starting place. Now, you can do this type of assessment in Everfit. You can get them tracking on an individual tracking app like Chronometer, MyFitnessPal, or even the Food Journal there. And then from there, start to assess this stuff, review the results, and create a plan. Set that starting place depending on, what they're actually doing and not just what we think they should be doing. This is going to allow you to get much closer to where the client is at the beginning, and then you can adjust from there. Protein intake, which we're going to talk about in a second. That's one of the most important things, right? Especially when it comes to fat loss and making sure that, we're able to stick to a calorie deficit because we're eating foods that fill us up, and, slow down digestion and keep us full and that type of thing, as well as, spare the muscle that we already do have, right? It's twofold when it comes to importance of protein. But if I say, hey, like, based on your weight, you're 70 kilo female, based on ideal optimal protein levels, you should be consuming at least 1.5, ideally 2.0 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And therefore, hey, I'm going to start you right off at 150 grams or 140 grams of protein. And they're like eating 80 every day. Like, for me to double their protein intake right off the bat, just because I feel like it's the right thing, it's way too much of a stretch. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. Now we could start them off at 105 because we know where they started, and then adjust and, add in serving sizes, get them to increase their nutritional knowledge, and then kind of go from there. That's the best way to scale this stuff and get them to a place where, they're closer to optimal, because originally we looked at what they're doing. You can do all this stuff and do this step, tip number 2, all in Everfit. Now, probably most importantly, moving forward, once you get a sense of like, okay, I have a basic idea of the right starting place for this client, the magic is in what happens after. It's not about just the right starting place, although that'll help them be successful from the beginning. It's how you can structure and monitor this process and adjust through time. It's really tough to manage what you don't measure. And that's where, if you guys have done more habit-based or behavioral coaching programs, or maybe that's part of your approach, it feels really good to build some of those things, but it can make it tough, because aspects of it are subjective, and a little bit all over the place to measure if it's working through time. It just makes the results of what you're doing less reliable. Now, if we take some of that stuff, which we're going to talk about in a second, but also add an objective approach, we can then manage and measure and influence those big picture variables that are going to get results, and that's going to lead to the most success. And again, if we think about, where I started this conversation at, if your coaching is a results-based business, you don't want to leave your results up to chance. So tracking it and getting your clients bought into that process, and also managing while you're giving feedback, is the most important thing that you could do. But what if people don't want to track what they're doing? That's probably the most common thing. Hopefully one of you guys has that exact question. It's like, hey, I've tried some of this stuff and my clients just don't want to do it. They think it's too much work. They think they're not, they don't have the knowledge and those type of things. I want you to think about it this way. Right now, and you probably know this stuff, people are willing to do crazy things to get results, myself included. But in this specific example, I don't stray too far from what will actually work or what's actually important. But they're willing to eat only meat for the rest of their lives if they feel like it's going to get them X result. It's going to get them leaner. They're going to feel amazing. They can start to see what's in it for them. So we need to position what we're asking them to do with why it's in their best interest. Not for us, not because it's going to be important for us, but why it's going to be important for them. I remember Kent. He's a client that was like, you're asking me to do what? I don't want to do this. Not only do I not know what I'm doing, which was kind of strange because he was an accounting professional and I was telling him to take a closer look at numbers. And he was thinking, I'm not good at any of that stuff. I'm like, you actually are. You just got to develop some habits and skills around this stuff. But I remember him saying, once he got over some of those initial stages of learning more about his food, and kind of, learning more about his food, putting it into action, building some confidence, he was able to get so much leaner while getting stronger, and it completely transformed his life. And he was a doubter at the beginning. I remember him saying, I was always a doubter of tracking my food intake and having a coach, set a specific plan. I thought I could just figure it out on my own. But once he saw those results and doing it in a way that he didn't have to do any things he disliked, it's a complete game changer for them. So we want to, and I can talk through this scenario a little bit more. We want them to get, see why it's in their best interest to take that next step and do those things. To me, it's like, when a client is saying, hey, well, I just, is there something else you can give me, or I don't want to track? It's really easy to just switch the plan or go in a different direction right off the bat. which is the worst thing you can do. You got to stick to your guns and give them the thing that you know is going to actually get work and do those things. Amazing, Safi. I'm glad that you love tracking because it helps you manage the right things and feel like you have control over the process. And it's just a tool. It doesn't mean you have to be perfect at it, but it gives you some insight around those things. But when you're saying, hey, I understand that this aspect is hard and you don't want to do it, but the reason why I'm asking you to do it is because I know it's going to get blank result. I know it's going to help you lose 15 pounds in the next 12 weeks. And that's what you came to me here for, as well as it's going to allow you to get results now, but also keep them later because you're going to learn more about your food and what makes you feel good. And you'll have better control over, the ins and outs of what you need to be doing with your nutrition. This is what's best for now and it's what's best for later. Why don't we try it over this process? And if it's not, getting you to where you're going, we can make some adjustments and then get them into the process. Matt, that's a great question. And I'm going to address that one later. And we'll dive into that one in terms of the PN style hand portions for tracking. Amazing. And then from here, especially the way we like to think about these things, and this is where some of the PN1 level concepts come into place, is that we want to almost think about this stuff, and I'll dive into this a little bit more. It's almost like what you're setting in terms of calories and macronutrient targets for someone on an individual level based on what they're currently doing and what they should be doing to get a specific result is the structure for someone's nutrition plan. It tells us what should get a result. It doesn't give us much insight around what they need to be doing to get that result. And that's where habits fill this type of stuff on a meal by meal basis or an action step basis. But we need that structure. This is the checks and balances for our fellow accounting friends over there that allow us to control the things that matter the most to get someone's goal. So we want to set some targets based on that. We'll talk about how to coach them within those targets and identify what they need to be doing to do that. But that's where we start. Through that process, we also, body weight and measuring your body weight through a basic bathroom scale is one of the easiest ways we can start to assess how things are changing. One body weight measurement doesn't tell me very much, right? It's a much better representation of how much water someone's carrying, or maybe the actual physical weight of the food that they consumed. But if we get more measurements throughout the week and start to assess averages on a week by week basis, we can start to get a sense of some trends. And that allows us to make adjustments and move things in the right direction. Now, we use tracking as just a tool. The goal of tracking these type of things isn't to become the best at tracking. It's to use that strategy and use those metrics to get where we're going. It's not the end all be all, but it allows us to measure and assess and keep tabs on the things that matter most. So we really need both. I remember, speaking of PN1, Coach Shobana, who went through our program, had also taken PN1, PN level 2, was really, influenced by the habit-based approach, which is amazing. And she came to me to get leaner. And she is well-versed in, building the right habits and identifying that type of stuff. But I got her tracking, and she was able to lose 6 kilos by getting closer to, the food she was eating on a day-to-day basis. And specifically, like where a habit-based approach was leaving some of the results up to chance. She, as a vegetarian client, she knew that, she needed to be consuming more protein, and some of her habits pushed her in that direction, but objectively, she just wasn't getting enough. So we added some structure to her process with a total amount of calories that she should be consuming on a range, enough protein. She got control over the checks and balances that would allow her to get leaner, kind of put this structure and habits approach, into action. And she was able to lose 6 kilos. So it's not that, hey, behaviorally and thinking on a meal by meal basis, how can I use some hand portions to get enough of the macronutrients and balance out my plate, but it's how those plates all add up together on a day-to-day basis that'll really allow us to get more precise results, or at least more reliable results. Does it work out perfectly? No, but we have more control over those things. It also takes people like Jen here, amazing results, and it gives them the structure and tools to make changes, even if they've never tracked before, right? A lot of times people think it's like, I can't track my nutrition. You need a PhD to track your nutrition. And I'm like looking back and I'm thinking like, I think you need a PhD to not track your nutrition. To eat completely mindfully in a way that's like balanced and nutritionally sound takes a lot of work and effort, especially to do it in a way that falls in line with your goals. The easiest way to get to that point is to get closer to those numbers, not abandon them altogether. Now you can coach this way using Everfit, monitoring food intake, using some of their tracking integrations with the food journal and the meal plan resources. You could also, and we're going to identify some habits in a second, you could start to put habit-based goals and put them into place and measure them with the habit tracker. And then you monitor how things are going through the weekly check-in process. And this is just the cornerstone of coaching an online client and getting great results. Now, tip number 4, I got 2 more tips for you. And I think these ones are a little bit quicker. If we think about the specific things within calorie balance that make it easier to adhere to and are also just as important, if there's 2 things that you need to focus on in a nutritional sense, it would be protein and food volume. One of the biggest things that derails fat loss clients is going to be hunger and cravings and their appetite. If you can stay full and if you can keep full, you're going to be in a much better chance to be successful now in getting results, but also keeping it off later. This is Scott. And if you guys didn't pick up on this, these are all of my clients that I've worked through over the years. Scott was able to lose 60 pounds, 6 pant sizes. And after, through the process, I picked up really quickly, but through just watching and observing what he was doing, but also him telling me, it's like, hey, the difference maker here for me is I'm eating much more protein and I'm eating in a way that's allowing me to stay full because I'm focusing on food volume, which we're going to talk about in a second. Number 1, protein is going to, in terms of satiety and feeling full of the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat, it's going to keep us full more than anything else. But also, if we can pair that protein with foods that have a higher level of weight for not a lot of calories, and that's a low level of energy density, and staying away from hyperpalatable foods that have a lot of calories and not a lot of weight, it allows us to stay fuller for longer. If you look at all diets, and everyone has different levels of success on different diets and different methodologies and approaches. And they work typically because they allow people to stay in a calorie deficit. But a lot of times with the one commonality of many successful diets, and it doesn't matter if it's vegan or sometimes even, like something like carnivore, a lot of times it's just like this energy density thing where it's like, hey, I'm eating a large amount of food, a large piece of meat, or a large salad that doesn't have tons of calories, right? Think about if you had a huge bowl of romaine lettuce, like a kilo of lettuce versus like a tablespoon of oil or peanut butter, we're talking about similar amount of calories for 16 grams in a single tablespoon serving, or literally a kilo. Mechanically, one's going to keep you fuller for longer. And if you add that to more protein, it's the best of both worlds. So in terms of thinking about this stuff, protein, consuming at least 1.5 grams per kilogram per day, upwards of, up to 2.5 grams per kilogram. There's literature to suggest eating more protein. At that point, there's diminishing returns and it makes it your full-time job is eating more protein. But that's definitely something to focus on, as well as making sure that you're prioritizing food volume. So eating a serving of vegetables or fruit each and every time you eat sets so many people up for success. Now, we want to do this as well while making sure that doing these things still falls in line with the overall structure that needs to get them results, because they could do this 5 times a day and it could put them in a calorie surplus, and that wouldn't be smart either. But that's how we structure things on a meal by meal basis and on a habit basis, and starting to focus on these things, at least as a coach, identifying the lowest hanging fruit and kind of going from there. Some helpful strategies. And these are all things that hey, as you're working with a client and starting to get a sense of is protein an issue? Is being prepared an issue? Is knowledge an issue? Is convenience something that they need to focus on? All these things. There are many helpful strategies out there. You can start to, again, I wouldn't throw all this stuff at them, but you can start to pinpoint what is the thing that's holding my client back, and how can I, with their help and support and buy-in, hold them accountable to some of those things, so that we remove barriers to nailing their plan and getting better and kind of going from there. Create resources around this stuff. You could give that to all of your clients. You could make one for a specific client. Then you could use it as a lead magnet. And you can deliver all of that stuff and assign habits and track progress, all using Everfit. Now, the last tip here. Fat loss is a game of compromise. I saw this quote from Mike Dowla of formerly of Stronger You. When it comes to fat loss, I remember him saying, you can have it all, you just can't have it all at once. And I'm not sure he invented that or anything, but I should credit it for him. I hope this acknowledges that. But fat loss itself is all about making quote unquote the right choices. That doesn't mean that you need to swear off ice cream forever, but you need to work around those things, and you need to be able to manage the checks and balances that allow you to stay on top of your plan and then kind of go from there. But at that point, like, hey, it's one of those things where, and good question, Linda. Hopefully I'll address that one later. So maybe you can tune into the recording, but thanks for coming. But from this point, it's like, some people are going to be able to eat quote unquote non-diet foods and work them into their plan and not do really good. Others just, can't handle that type of stuff. In my experience, as someone that used to swear off those things entirely, I found much more success not fearing any of those things. And then working them into my plan within reason, and then not feeling like I needed to do that. So it's all about compromise and what you feel like and your client feels like are their non-negotiables to sticking with the plan and kind of going from there. For some people, it's like, hey, I really like a glass of wine and I would like to, continue to drink alcohol, where others is like, hey, snack foods, and kind of go from there. Yeah, good point, Carla, around kidney issues and protein intake. Absolutely. In terms of like people with pre-existing kidney issues, we have tons of literature to support that. If you don't have anything like that, eating more protein is not only a good idea, but it's probably what's important for your results. But even for people with kidney issues, eating them at a point that's within reason, getting closer with their medical team and professionals to monitor how that's impacting their kidneys, and then going from there. But pre-screening around that type of stuff is super important as well. Now, the one thing about a lot of us are coaches and we have people's best interests in mind, but we also need to keep in mind that, like, hey, a fat loss phase specifically, it isn't supposed to last forever. Like, so the way someone eats right now doesn't mean that, of course, we're building habits that hope serve them well, but it doesn't mean that exactly what they're doing right now needs to last forever. And if anything, that could be the thing that's holding them back. If they're thinking like, hey, I need to do something that is going to last me forever and I'm going to have to do forever, that part can be pretty overwhelming. It might be actually get in the way of people's results. Sometimes being in the mindset, like, I'm doing something short-term for now, and here's roughly how long it's going to take, and here's the exit plan, and here's what it looks like, is going to be the best of both worlds for a lot of people. A little bit of short-term discomfort for results. We do work, then rest, right? Not just rest, not just not pay attention to it. And starting to frame out things that way allows us to work with clients within their best interest, but also work with them long-term, but not just, they can start to see why what's in it for them. Now, when it comes to the right food choices, no food is good or bad, especially when it comes to fat loss. It's just better or worse within the context of your goals. With that being said, like, hey, if there's things that I picked up through the years, takeout food and, Uber Eats and skip the dishes and convenience, like, a lot of times, although it's come a long way in terms of your options, in many cases, that wasn't designed to be low calorie, right? It's more designed to be like hyper palatable in many cases. So a lot of times, especially if clients aren't paying attention to this stuff, they can't eat out more than once per day and a few times per week and still stay within their goals or a calorie deficit. And a lot of times, same thing goes for quote unquote non-diet foods, right? Like, include these things a few times per week, but within reason, so you can find the best of both worlds. Oh, I remember client David here, and him saying, hey, I learned through this process, if I was able to, like, if I want to go for some drinks or have some dessert, I can make some considerations and work it into my plan and not do the whole, I'm never going to do that again, swear it off, restrict, and then go off the rails. That type of approach and making the right choices is the best path for a lot of people. So today I outlined 5 strategies to help set up a plan for your clients and coach them to help nutrition clients and online clients lose weight. We need to, number 1, help them build some momentum with quick wins right off the bat, not get in their way. set the right starting place for the amount of energy that they're consuming. And that usually is best served when we get a closer sense of what they're currently doing and not just what the textbook says they should do. To get great results, we want to create structure and give them a chance to actually self-monitor what's going on and closer to those things. Increase the amount of protein that they're consuming as well as food volume, because that's going to keep them full and keep them on pace, as well as help them facilitate the right choices. And when you do all of those things, you're going to get great results for your nutrition clients. Again, the Everfit Academy and Everfit itself as the coaching software has done such a great job of putting all this stuff together in one place. These are the type of things that you can start working in with your clients to get a great result. Now, the one thing I had mentioned, hey, a good way to put all this stuff together. And I know Coach Josie on my team is in the chat as well. The one thing I wanted to extend to you guys as a bonus for attending this, and a great way to put some of this stuff right into action, is my completely free 3-day quick start nutrition coaching challenge. If you're interested in working with online clients on their fat loss, this 3-day challenge will give you everything you need to get started. The templates, the forms, the approach, the process, how to set up a plan. It's an extended version of today and probably the best 3 days you'll spend in your coaching business all year. So you got to check that out. I got a link right here if you guys want to check it out. And there's Josie as well dropping in there. So sign up for that. We'll get the process started and then we'll go from there. But I also wanted to, and I'm sure Rob's going to pop in a second here. Technology is so cool. People just like appear. But we also have some time for some questions as well. See? There you go, right? It's so cool. You're like a genie over there. It's like, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no. Like Mark said, we definitely got about 10 or so minutes for questions. I know we've got a couple that were dropped in the chat earlier. So just to go through it, Matt was the first one to pop a question in, and he said some people really dislike numbers and referring to the PN star, which you kind of tracked on, but just wanted to circle back around to that.
Yeah, no, I think for like the PN's hand portion guide is just such a great visual for people to get a better sense of like what they need to be doing to balance their plates and on a meal by meal basis. I think that part's super smart within that. To me, it's almost like, again, applying this stuff with the best of both worlds, where it's like, hey, that probably in and itself shouldn't just be the entire structure of someone's plan, because they could do this on a meal by meal basis, and they could do that and stay within a calorie deficit. But at the same time, there's no, checks and balances around what happens over the entire course of the day or those type of things. So to me, it's almost like it starts to leave a little bit of the results up for chance. What I would prefer that we do is like, hey, and again, as long as someone's like not negatively impacted by the numbers, which as a coach, you can tease out and screen and kind of go from there if they have any pre-existing issues with eating disorders or something like that. But if they truly just don't like numbers as a preference or those type of things, I would also always encourage them to try out the process and get closer to those numbers, because a lot of times that's kind of like almost a feeling and thought people have going into that process, that they're not just going to like it and they're not going to be able to do it and those type of things. But usually it's not as daunting as they think, and kind of go from there. So I'd get them to, again, as long as there's not any of the pre-existing stuff, to start that process. And that starts to develop like the checks and balances around what someone needs to do on an individual level to get a result, right? We do that. Now, in terms of a nutrition competency and knowledge perspective, it's still not a bad idea to teach them how to eat within that structure. And that's usually where something like hand portion tracking or specific targets around individual meals, or better choices, worse choices, those type of stuff come in line with what they need to be doing. So we always like to think about yes and no, and working within both of those spheres. And that's we like to call it structure and habits, and not just abandoning one for the other. Because just to tap into, I have nothing against this stuff, but if you focus mainly on that behavioral stuff, a lot of times it's just tougher to manage and measure and take a look at. So it leaves more of the results up to chance. To me, it's like, why wouldn't you do both?
Yeah, cool. I'd say too that like a big thing with that is really educating them on like why you're asking them to do it, right? Not just saying like I need you to track it for the sake of tracking, but understanding or helping them understand, this is the value that we're getting by you actually tracking the numbers.
I think when people can start to see why it's in their best interest, they're more likely to fall in line with those type of things.
Well, so yeah, so then the next question was from Linda. I'm not sure if she's still in here. She might have jumped off, but her question was, in terms of coaching a client with thyroid-based issues, in particular Hashimoto's, which can really hinder fat loss, are there any changes to the usual protocols that you've found successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing we need to understand about like a lot of hormonal issues is number one, and we have some dietitians in the room and stuff. We're not trying to make nutrition recommendations to manage the hormonal issues or Hashimoto's or anything like that. But we need to understand how it could potentially impact one of the results or processes that we're helping a client achieve. In my experience, something like that will impact the checks and balances of this. It does make it harder for someone to lose weight, be it that there's an impact on their metabolism. Maybe they can't consume as many calories, but that at the same time doesn't make it any less worthwhile, or like it just makes it a little bit harder. They're kind of like a bit more behind the eight ball. Now, mindset wise, they need to know that so they know it's not impossible and their goals are still worthwhile and they can still achieve them. So they need to go in with that. It's like, hey, this doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that we have to be more particular about certain things. And maybe you can't consume as much food while still being in a calorie deficit would be the first thing. With that being said, it's ever so more important to make sure that they're eating enough protein and high volume foods to stay full, as well as just not since they don't have as much food to work with, not going super low on something like carbohydrate, which will also can impact some of their thyroid issues. So just being a bit more balanced and just knowing that this may take longer and then kind of go from there. But outside of that, the principles are still the same. They're just like a bit more impacted would be my thought around that.
Cool. All right. So a couple more questions filtering through here. Someone asked, does the food tracker on Everfit client app show the calories? So I'll handle that one. Yes, you should. Also, just kind of on that as well, I'll just wanted to let everyone know, following this being, March is National Nutrition Month in the US and possibly in other countries as well. But just on that, all of our webinars this month will be focused around nutrition. So I'll be hosting a webinar on Tuesday next week. Keep an eye out for an email or an app pop-up coming through in the next couple of days to register for that. But I'll be walking through all the different tools and functionality for nutrition that we have on Everfit and how that can adapt to either an individual coach's knowledge and skill level, and then also a client's level as well. So obviously Marc's talked to you about the importance of tracking, but we'll kind of talk about ways to do that, on all sorts of varying levels too. So definitely keep an eye out for that in the coming days. And then Marc will be back later this month as well to talk you through some strategies around how to sell the nutrition coaching aspect of your products and services too. So if you haven't registered for those, I highly encourage you to jump on them.
Very cool.
But yeah, so sorry, back to the questions. Tammy says, I'm having trouble with a client I'll start that one again. I'm having trouble getting a client to track appropriately or meet her calorie goal. I asked her if she was not tracking everything, and she said that she is. What would you recommend? Her weight hasn't budged.
It's a great question and a very common scenario. So know that like you're not alone in that one. I do think there's a few things going on. Usually, like at this point, we kind of want to and again, talking about troubleshooting, we want to put our detective hat on and start to think about, okay, well, what are some of the things that could impact this? If you feel as if like you've reviewed her food logs and, kind of like assess that she is being accurate and she is truly eating that amount of food, or reporting everything that she's doing, which is generally the case. But usually sometimes people are like, hey, adherence just isn't perfect. It sounds like she is eating too much food for her goals, and everyone's going to be on a sliding scale would be the biggest thing, right? So just because maybe you're at 1,400 calories for her and it feels low, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, the proof is in the pudding. Either we need to get her moving more, or it could be too much food overall, especially if she's also describing that, hey, she doesn't feel very hungry. She feels, somewhat like content. Energy isn't an issue or anything along those lines. Could just be too much food and it might need to be lower. Take comfort in knowing that number one, there is some underreporting in most cases, generally anyway. We're talking 30 to 40%. So a number that feels low might actually be quite a bit higher, as well as, maybe it just isn't capturing some things. So we want to get a little bit closer in terms of like troubleshooting and that type of stuff. So get closer to the things that, and, prompt her and ask some questions around like, hey, is there anything that we're missing in terms of like liquids or sauces or, things that could add a lot of calories that maybe you're just not capturing? I think there's a good way and a positive way of approaching that without being like kind of finger pointy, blamey. So it's kind of troubleshooting those type of things and go from there.
Cool. All right. We've just hit 12. So this is one more, or there's kind of a two-part question left. So we'll take this one as a last question. But so Nick asks, if someone has a history of eating disorders, would you suggest they seek medical help and deny the client, or would you work alongside with them? Is it a question of personal comfort level? And then to add to that, a second part of the question is, if nutrition and tracking meals is a sensitive topic for a client, how do I go about this? May be very eager and frustrated to see results, but it's hard to talk to them about tracking with these kinds of clients. Any tips?
Yeah, well, first of all, if you outwardly know that a client has a history of an eating disorder, then it's one of those things where that's starting, depending on who you are and your level of expertise. And I know you have some dietitians in the group, but a basic nutrition certification or as a personal trainer, making any nutrition recommendations in the effort to manage that would be out of scope. It's one of those things where it's like, hey, this does take, they're best suited to work with someone with a higher level of expertise in that specific area. And it's just usually in most cases, best for everyone. And that's not to say like, hey, we want to help everyone, but it's usually best for everyone. It's usually too much effort on our parts as well. And then this is coming from someone that loves helping everyone. It's just usually not worth it for you as well as them and their safety and their concerns. We want to take all that stuff into perspective. With that being said, there is a difference between, maybe some problematic past eating habits and a true full-blown diagnosis of an eating disorder. So I think if you can pick up on, and again, sometimes you have to read between the lines and ask more questions and kind of go from there. If someone has something that isn't necessarily a diagnosis of an eating disorder, that comes down to personal comfort level. What I would also, so like you could still work with them if they don't, maybe they're showing signs that you have to be careful of these things and ask more questions and go from there. But a lot of times people just haven't found quote unquote the right approach for them either. And sometimes your support and stuff can be the difference maker. So we want to keep that in perspective as well. With that being said, even if someone discloses to you that they have an eating disorder or something like this, ethically, I personally think, number one, you don't work with them in a paid capacity and giving them recommendations, but that also doesn't mean that you can't be the person that helps them find support and take that next step in terms of like giving them recommendations of like where to go, passing along maybe resources that aren't coming from you and that kind of stuff to give them the help that they need. Because I know a lot of times this scope conversation kind of just rubs me the wrong way because it's, people hear something like that and they drop someone like a bad habit in terms of like, hey, I can't help you, go here, that kind of stuff. Whereas in my perspective, I think ethically you can still support them in a different way, be it not in a paid capacity, not in a way that you're acting as a content expert or coach, but you can point them in the right direction. So you want to keep that stuff in mind as well. For Althea's follow-up question around, hey, a sensitive topic, I think it's one of those things where, especially in an online capacity, more communication, the better, and trying to get a sense of, I've noticed you're not very open to talk about this. Like, do you feel comfortable sharing a little bit more about why that could be difficult for you so you can get more information and kind of go from there? I think trying to just tease out where someone's coming from, because a lot of times they go into that scenario thinking about what you'll do with them and what you're going to approach things. In reality, I haven't met many online coaches, nutrition coaches, personal trainers that expect their clients to be perfect or any of those things. But I think we try to break down those barriers and just get a better line of communication right from the beginning, to get a sense of why is someone, why is it a sensitive topic? And it doesn't sound like you fully know why, right? So it's trying to dig a little bit deeper into that if they feel comfortable in filling you in, because then you could find the approach that would work best for them.